Oh, hey there, and welcome to my vintage home arcade. So I've been collecting vintage arcade games on and off for about 25 years or so. But I'm at an interesting point because I now have more games than I've ever owned before. Currently we have 19. 17 are upstairs here in the house and what we consider to be our arcades. So what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of going to go through each one individually briefly to tell you a little bit about it, why it's special, and maybe why we have it in our arcades. So let's get started. So I guess you're not supposed to have favorites with your children, but Crystal Castles is probably my favorite in the entire collection, mostly because of the nostalgic element I have when I played it as a kid in 1983 when it first came out, and also just I think the cabinet is absolutely the most beautiful cabinet ever in the history of classic arcade games. Everyone has their opinion. I think it's Crystal Castles. It's just gorgeous with the waterfall lighting, the MC Escher inspired art, the front art on the kick plate also that just totally matches everything else in the cabinet. It's a complete package. It's also a very fun game to play. I think it's the perfect kind of amalgamation between a Pac-Man kind of game and what would become now what we would consider to be a platformer. Let's take a look in the back of this one real quick. Okay, so there's a couple interesting things in the Crystal Castles. The serial number, it's number 4700, which is kind of interesting. That's a 00 at the end of the serial number. But this is one of the last Crystal Castles ever made. They made about 4,800 and some change of these games. This is one of the last ones on the assembly line. The other thing that's really interesting with this game is the monitor. And the reason why it's interesting is that originally Crystal Castles came with a monitor made by the Matsushika company. It's a 19-inch monitor that's notoriously terrible. It's one of those monitors. The guy Todd Tuckey who runs TNT Amusements has said basically you just throw it away. And that was the monitor that was supposed to come with Crystal Castles. But this is a Geo 7 monitor made by Electrohome, which is a standard arcade monitor, but not the monitor that belongs in this game. But this is the factory monitor, and you can see the serial number matches about the chassis and right here. So I don't know, maybe they just ran out of those monitors at Atari and the last couple hundred they used these, or maybe they realized the other monitor was not so great to begin with. Otherwise in here it's a typical arrangement, and again you can go on that video and see the full restoration. You have the typical Atari power supply that we totally rebuilt. This game was pretty filthy inside when we got it. It had been sitting in a warehouse for a long time. The audio regulator board, they come in different varieties. That's the Crystal Castles one. And then the Crystal Castles is just one printed circuit board. There's no subboard, and that's it. This is not the original board. I have the original board downstairs that has a RAM issue that I haven't quite been able to fix. But this one I actually bought from Todd Tuckey from TNT Amusements. And it's a very low serial number 97, which is kind of funny. So it's got a real low serial number there and a real high serial number on all the other components. The other interesting thing too, if you see the back of this panel, it's stark white laminated. So this was probably a leftover piece that originally wasn't meant to be actually outside and adorned with artwork. And sometimes you'll see little scrap pieces in Atari games that are either laminated white or even have misprinted artwork. I used to own a game that was a kangaroo game, and inside of it was cut up artwork, or maybe it was the Dig Dug, but it had cut up artwork from a Gravatar inside, using as like the support brackets and those kind of things. So those are kind of some of, I guess nothing went to waste at some of these factories. Tempest is our only color vector game that we own, and it was Atari's most well-produced color vector game. It's a great game. It's a classic. The one thing I love about Tempest so much, having it in the arcade, is it was one of the few huge Atari hits that never really got a release on home systems, mostly because of the vector graphics. They just couldn't accurately reproduce it. I had a version of Tempest for my Atari ST computer years later. Even then, it still wasn't the same as this Vector Classic. Tempest also has the notoriety in our collection of being the least reliable game that we own. It has the reliability of probably a 1970s Italian sports car, and it can be rather frustrating, but as of right now, it's working. So let's take a look in the inside real quick, because there's some interesting stuff in here. So this is the Wells Gardner 6100 Vector color monitor. This can strike fear or terror into some collectors trying to make it reliable and durable. A lot of it with these monitors are that it's basically two sections. You have what they call the deflection board and then the high voltage board as well. There are a lot of modifications over the years that have come to try to make these more reliable. This has got what they call the LV2000 mod, which helps with some of the voltage issues, but I don't know. I mean, I've had bad luck with these monitors. It seems like there's always something kind of new wrong. A resistor just died last weekend that we replaced, and over 60% of this monitor, these components are actually new. So, you know, it's not for the faint of heart. Color vector games, especially if you venture into the Sega ones, which my understanding are just really, really tough to keep running. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this game, I just wanted to point out, is the cabinet has a good bit of damage. If you see these corners, they're broken off on the back. It's not so bad on the other side, but this is from, at some point this game took a tumble. The gentleman we bought this game from bought these games in 1985 from a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant that went out of business. And it still up here has the tag of the licensing for 1985, and I just decided not to take it off because I thought it was pretty cool. There's been some debate in the house whether we're going to fix these corners and put new artwork. This game is usually between other games, so it's not quite as visible. This side of the artwork is pretty scratched and banged up. The other side is actually in pretty good shape. But Vector games, again, they're a challenge. They are very beautiful. I mean, it's just the glow of Vector can't be duplicated with any other means on any other kind of emulator, any other kind of system. So keeping these games going is it's a lot of work sometimes, but I think it's worth it. Pretty unique stuff. This is the somewhat harder to find Cabaret-sized cabinet of Outrun. They made Outrun in 4 different variations. They made a full-size cabinet, a sit-down that doesn't move, and then a sit-down that actually moves around when you play the game. And the Cabaret came out a little bit later. This is the second time actually I've ever owned an Outrun Cabaret. It's one of my favorite games. I love this cabinet style for some reason. I really couldn't tell you why. I just find it very appealing. A lot of times these are smashed, these control panels, because they're just plastic. There's a guy named Win that you can look up on Facebook and Instagram. He goes under Win Outrun, that will make you a new one of these out of fiberglass, which is 10 times better than the original one. It really helped bring this game back to life. We did a full restoration on this game. In fact, it was the most extensive restoration I've ever done on an arcade game. And you can watch the video, we'll post it up here, a montage of everything we did. It went through about a 6-month process of totally rebuilding this game. But fantastic game, super great music, one of the all-time classic drivers. I love Sega games, and if I had one thing to say about my collection right now, that I wish I had a little more space, because there are about 4 or 5 classic Sega games I would just love to have in my collection. I just don't have the space for them right now. It's hard to argue that Miss Pac-Man may be the classic of classics, the all-time champion of the arcade. I think when most people think of 80s video game classics, they usually always are drawn to Miss Pac-Man. I actually play this game more than any game we currently have in the arcade. I usually play it almost once a day. And I'm actually 13th in the world right now on the Twin Galaxies board, which I don't even know what that means. I guess I'll put that on my resume. Anyway, it's somewhat unrestored. We bought this game about 2 years ago from an auction in Texas, and we haven't really done a lot to it other than replace the control panel and attempt to fix the original joystick. Otherwise, it's pretty much as it is. It's fairly reliable. I did go through this year and built a whole new wiring harness for it because it was getting a little twitchy in some areas. But the side art and the cabinet, pretty much a battle-weary warrior. I mean, it's all beat up, it's faded, it's chipping. Maybe eventually we'll repaint it and re-stencil it. I don't know. We'll just have to wait to see. This one is just kind of just an honest, unrestored game. But I love it, and I think it's hard to have a collection of any size of these games without having at least one of the Pac games. And Miss Pac is the one that most people tend to enjoy the most, and especially me. If any major company doesn't quite get the credit they deserve for classic arcade games, it has to be TAITO. There's a funny story about elevator action. In 1983, when the market was going south for arcade games and home video games, they had this thing called the AMOA trade show every year. And at that trade show, there were a lot of Laserdisc games that were coming out and being pushed by manufacturers, but operators didn't like them because they were too expensive and they just didn't have the long-term profit value of traditional arcade games. And there were actually two games at the AMO trade show in '83 that were huge standouts. One of them was Centuri and Konami's track and field game, and the other one was Elevator Action. This game was a huge hit during a downturn in the market, and it's a huge classic, and I think it's a little really heralded now as far as when people talk about classic arcade games. It mostly was sold as a kit for older TAITO cabinets, games like Jungle Hunt or Alpine Ski. This is a very rare, dedicated cabinet version of this game. I love these TAITO cabinets with the bright color sides and their logo splashed on it. Believe it or not, this game is almost 99% all original. Only the marquee has been changed. We got a repo marquee because the other one was very badly flaking, and put some new buttons on there. But that was it. I mean, it's even the control panel is in fantastic shape. The other really interesting thing about this game is originally it was part of an Aladdin's castle, which we still have the name tag there. We put on the keys for the lock, and it ran off tokens. But this is just a super, super fun game. It's one of our favorites in the arcade. I love the light-up control instructions here right on the bottom of the bezel. TAITO made some really great stuff. Hopefully one day they made another game that's pretty obscure called Space Dungeon, which I would love to have. It's very, very hard to find, but maybe someday I'll find myself a Space Dungeon to go right next to the elevator action here. Some of these TAITO games from the early 80s are kind of a menagerie of wires and adapters inside of the machines. It's all thanks to this filter board where everything kind of drives through and out of the filter board. These were designed to stay within FCC regulations of not interfering with CB radios, which I guess were still a thing in the early 80s. The board itself, elevator action, I have a couple versions of this board. There's a 4-board version and even a 5-board version. The one on here is actually the 5-board version, which is, I think, the original one that came with this game. So one of the really difficult things with these TAITO games of this era are the power supplies, which are terrible. Notoriously bad. This one actually has the original power brick in it, which is rare. That right now is actually finally starting to create some problems. If you can see, one of the big problems is the heat from these things for some reason is terrible. And somebody at some point actually took one of these off to create some sort of off the board heatsink. You can see how black it is down there. And the fuses on this game right now are constantly blowing on the 10 volts. So we're going to replace this with a switching power supply, but keep the original one in here just for durability, because this has been a recent occurrence where this is no longer really working that well. So I knew it was just a matter of time. But that's the inside of a TAITO game. Pretty interesting and a nightmare to work on if you are trying to build your own filter board. This is a UNISYSTEM that was originally a Donkey Kong. I'm not going to go too much into this game. This is actually my wife's favorite game, the Versus Super Mario Brothers. We also have boards and chips for it to play several other UNISYSTEM games, such as Castlevania, which is my favorite, and Excitebike, and Golf, which is a terrible golf game for the Versus system. But anywho, if you want to watch the full restoration on this game, what we did, you can watch the video. I'll post it up here somewhere that we did. These are great games, great cabinets. It's funny because when I first started collecting about 20 plus years ago, you could go to auction and buy one of these for peanuts, like under $50. And now they're becoming quite collectible, I think, with the interest in vintage Nintendo products. And Super Mario is a great game that I happen to be terrible at. So, but anyway, great game. It came out great. Happy to have this one in the collection. It's a big crowd pleaser when people come over for sure. for arcade collecting purists, this game is going to be the one they hate the most because it is a Donkey Kong Jr. We restored it after it had been converted to like 18 different things over the years. We got it when it was a final fight and not working. The original Sanyo monitor that was in it, unfortunately, was not restorable or fixable. So even though I do have a Donkey Kong Jr. board and the original power supply, it was set up for JAMA, so I went ahead and put in a dun 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 LCD. It's the only game we have that has an LCD monitor in it, and it is indeed running a 60-in-1 multi-arcade board, which is not the greatest multi-board. The reason I did this is because I love Donkey Kong Jr. It's another game I'm not very good at, but having a lot of these games like Frogger and Galaga, games that I really don't have any intention to ever own, when we have people over, they want to play these games. And every once in a while I like to play a game like Time Pilot or Donkey Kong 3, and it's more of a space requirement. If I wanted to put this game back originally, it would be very easy to do so. The control panel's original. I restored the side art and everything back to what it should originally be. So I'm not too upset because the things that have been changed are very easily changeable back to the original what it was. I felt like I brought it back. And I don't get too bent out of shape about multi-games and things. I think as long as someone is not ruining an original game to make a multi-game, they're fine. And this game gets a lot of traction. Again, when we have people over, you know, a lot of games like Congo Bongo is fun to play every once in a while, but I don't necessarily want to own a Congo Bongo game. So this is our multi-game, so this is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the collection as far as arcade purists go, because it does have that LCD monitor in it. Welcome to our only cocktail cabinet in the entire collection. I'm not a fan of cocktail cabinets per se. They are pretty interesting. I do like the Atari ones, however, because I mean, how can you argue with the wood grain goodness from Atari? This game I originally purchased about 1.5 years ago when I first moved to Seattle for the specific purpose to start messing with Vector, which I didn't have a lot of experience with, and we got this one up and running pretty quickly. And we totally restored the top and the bottom, made it look super fantastic, and we ended up falling in love with the game. And I just think it's a great place to have one right in the middle here in the arcade. Space-wise, it works out. So let's take a look inside. If you've never seen inside a cocktail game, especially an Atari one, what you have in here, the way it's designed is pretty smart. This was the second generation of traditional Atari cocktail games. They made several different versions of the games, but the cocktails were never as widely produced as their uprights, just not as popular since they were for kind of a specific audience. So we have the monitor, obviously. This is the main CPU board here on the side, and then you have what they call the audio regulator board and the coin mix and the speaker underneath. One of the problems with this particular game, you can see that there's been a lot of deterioration here. The inside of the wood is broken, and it's from this little kickstand that looks like either just eroded or somebody broke off at some point. So we haven't fixed that, and I guess there's really no point since it's never going to be on location again. It's also missing, there should be some instructions here, paper instructions that tell you how to set up the game. I put a blue tint on the plexi that sits between the monitor and the game itself, and I did that to try to mimic the blue tint in the upright version of the game. So if you see here, this is without the tint. It's very bright. There's a lot of great contrast, and there's a piece of tinted glass with the blue, and we put it over top of it. It gives it a more kind of bluish tint like the upright, but otherwise it's just kind of a fun game, and yet another Vector game in our collection, and it's fairly reliable. We don't have too many problems with this game actually once we rebuilt it. This is a Cabaret cabinet version of Centipede. Centipede was one of Atari's best-selling games of all time, and of course one of the programmers was Donna Bailey, one of the few female programmers to work at Atari during the classic era. Actually one of the few female programmers to work in the video game industry at that point. We bought this out of a guy's garage that was actually an airplane hangar, and he had all sorts of amazing stuff. The crazy thing about this particular Centipede is that Atari serial numbers tend to be sequential, and they have the sequential ones that go from 1 to whatever to how many they produce, and they also have a 6-digit number for the Irish built cabinets. But this serial number goes beyond the original US production So this game technically shouldn't exist. And I have a couple theories about this game just because there's some weirdness inside that we're going to take a look at. And I think this one may have been made at the end for some sort of promotional purpose for Atari, even though I cannot prove that. But let's take a look in the back real quick. This mini marquee on the bottom of the Centipede is interesting. Not all Centipedes seem to have been translucent enough to actually light up from behind. And a lot of other Cabaret owners I've talked to, there is no light or any fixture for a light at all for this marquee, but ours has a light, and I believe it's actually factory wired for this light, which might add to some question about why the serial number is also out of place. In the back, we see it's a very traditional light fixture that somebody probably replaced at some point, which is the household unit, which is fairly common for light-up marquees. But what we see here, what it's plugged into, is this thing that says service switch. And this is actually a part that was very common in Atari pinball machines. And it's factory wired. You can tell by not only the color of the wires, but how it's done. And it's even properly earth grounded to the coin mech here. And it's been there so long, it's actually rusted. I just don't think anyone would slapdash put that together like that. I think this is definitely a dedicated version. For some reason, mine has it, and that might lend to the mystery. If we go back up here and look at the serial number, the serial number on this machine is number 4064, where according to Atari, they made about 3,900 some odd games. So this is outside of those serial numbers, if the serial numbers were indeed sequential, adding to the mystery of this machine, which is why I think this machine was actually made for either some other purpose other than commercial service. And the coin counter is very low in this game for a Centipede. So it might have been just designed or manufactured for something very specific. Look at this little guy. You just want to give it a hug. It's the smallest game in our entire collection. It's the Cabaret Battlezone. We just did a video on this. We just restored this game. So check out that video if you want to see more about Battlezone Cabaret than you probably ever wanted to see or ever wanted to know. Super cool game. I was happily surprised that when we had our party last weekend, this game was extraordinarily popular. People, almost everyone played it quite extensively, which kind of shocked me. I don't know why, but I guess there's some timeless nature to the 3D environment, even as primitive as it is, compared to games now you can buy for your Xbox or whatnot, where it's just a total open sandbox world. But I love this game. It's I don't know why. It's just a fun game, even though I'm not particularly great at it. But check out the other video if you want to see more about this one. Now, this is one that we just totally restored. I talk about it both in the restoration video you can watch if you're really interested in the whole process of this game, or in my Century video in part 2, I talk extensively about Mikey. This is just a really interesting and unique game. I love playing this game. It is punishing to learn how to play. It is not a game you can just jump into. We had a friend over at the house recently, and she wanted to play this game, and she gave up after playing it about 4 or 5 times. She just couldn't understand it. And I get it because, again, the rule set is kind of ridiculous for 1984. But once you get the hang of it, it's a lot of fun. This game has a lot of unique features you can look at our video. It has multiple boards inside, mostly from the Centauri Konami era of video games, like Circus Charlie is about to pop up, which is the 3rd last game Centauri ever released, compared to Mikey, which is the last game Centauri would ever release. So there you go, Mikey. Super fun. I love this game. No one else probably does, but who cares? I love it. You know, Rally X just doesn't get the credit it deserves in the grand scope of classic arcade games. It was constantly overshadowed by a game that came out at exactly the same time by Namco, same company, which was, of course, Pac-Man, because the games are very similar, kind of maze chase games. I like Rally X. It's interesting and unique. You can watch the full video of the almost full restoration as well we did on this one. You don't really see a lot of Rally X's anymore, and I don't know if you ever really saw a lot to begin with, I guess Midway at the time was just trying to pump out as many Pac-Mans as they possibly could, and Rally X probably got pushed to the side. But fun game, unique game. I love the orange team molding and these very late 70s, early 80s graphics on this game. Even if you hate the game, you've got to love the cabinet. The cabinet is just drop dead gorgeous. I have a lot of people, they tend to ask me, they're interested in purchasing a arcade game for their home or their game room or for their kids, about what they should buy. And one of the games I always recommend if you want like an authentic arcade experience and not like some sort of slap together multi-game that runs on like an emulator, get yourself a Neo-Geo. These are relatively inexpensive. You can usually get a nice Neo-Geo for around $500 or $600. We only paid $325 for this Neo-Geo at an auction a couple of years ago. And then what you can always buy, instead of having to track down the individual cartridges, which some people like to do because some people like to collect them, you can get one of these multi-carts, and they come in a couple different ways. There's some very fancy, very nice ones, and there's also some very inexpensive ones you can buy, such as this one I have in here, which is what they call a 161-in-1. It's a Chinese-made product. The emulation is on the ROMs is pretty good. I've never really run into any problems with any of the games. And here you have a whole bunch of selection of games to play, so you can play all your favorites. There are a couple that aren't on here. There's a game called League Bowling I love a lot that's for some reason not on this multi-cart, but just a great way to have a bunch of games in your game room. These cabinets are pretty sturdy, pretty reliable. We've never really had a ton of problems. We had a little bit of an issue with the monitor at some point, but that's been about it. So you can get yourself a pretty good one. I put chrome T-molding on this thing, which is probably controversial, but I think it looks great. I usually don't do crazy color T-molding, but hey, sometimes you gotta live. You gotta live. Super fun game, Smash TV. This is actually one of the few games from the 90s, though it's very early 90s, that we actually own. Most of the games we have are in the 80s. Smash TV was available as this dedicated 25-inch version and a 19-inch version as well. I have a lot of fond memories of playing Smash TV in a bowling alley I used to go to when I was in high school, so don't judge that I spent a lot of time hanging out in a bowling alley. But anywho, this is a lot of fun, this game, and a lot of people tend to like it when they come over. It's such a great kind of update of the Robotron 2084 concept, but with 2 players. It takes place in the far future of 1999, so you know, thank goodness the future is far away, right? But anywho, there's a funny story about this game, is that we wanted one of these in our collection pretty badly, but they're hard to find, and usually when you find them, they've been converted or in terrible shape. And we were literally driving to an auction saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if they had a 25-inch Smash TV? It's like, oh, there's no way they're going to have one of those, because at auctions, it's kind of a random, whatever they have, and they usually never have exactly what you're looking for. But lo and behold, they had this, which is one of the nicest Smash TVs I have seen in anyone's collection. A lot of times the artwork on the sides is faded and torn up, and this game is just beautiful. It's in amazing shape, considering these games tended to be abused because, you know, kids are out there, you know, spilling drinks and acting like a fool. But this is quite a survivor, and we haven't really done much of a restoration to it. It has a new marquee. The marquee was super faded. A lot of times the red tends to fade out of these rather quickly, but otherwise it's pretty much all original, so it's been quite the trooper in its lifespan, and we're really happy to have this in our collection. I think this would be one that we would have a hard time getting rid of if we ever had to get rid of any of them. This game has a very interesting history because this is one of the few games that I have actually owned twice in my lifetime. I bought this game about 15 years ago when I lived in Memphis, and then about 10 years ago, plus or minus a year, hard to keep track in your old age, I sold all my games to move to Houston. I didn't have that many. I had a Moon Patrol, a Millipede, and a really nice Pac-Man cocktail. But the gentleman who I sold this game to when I lived in Memphis, he was, I guess, tired of owning it, and he sold it back to me. I had it shipped up here to Seattle. And when I bought it originally, it was a game called Tiger Road. It had been converted, and then I deconverted it back to the Moon Patrol. At some point, we're going to do a total restoration, strip down the cabinet, re-stencil everything with this game. It has a chunk of the side missing. You can actually watch a video where I unwrap it on my channel when it was kind of a mystery what it was, but now I've spoiled the surprise. Anyway, Moon Patrol is a super fun game. It's one of the few Williams games that they released that they didn't actually develop. IREM, however want to pronounce it, small Japanese company, they actually developed this game for Williams to distribute here in the United States. So it's one of the rare games where Williams didn't actually develop this game. But great game. It's a classic. It's a lot of fun. It can get pretty difficult as it ramps up in difficulty. But anyway. STARGATE, the sequel to Defender. We bought this game. It had been sitting outside on a gentleman's porch in East Texas for years. And we bought it from him. It was in pretty dire shape, but we brought it back to life slowly but surely. And this is another game that could really benefit from some cabinet work and re-stenciling. The cabinet on the bottom is kind of shredded, which is very typical for some Williams games. I guess it was just how they were manufactured. But what we did with this game was we have inside here what's called a J-Rock, which is a board that utilizes the same hardware. It's not an emulator like a lot of these multi-boards, to make the ability to play multiple Williams games. What you can do is hold down the first two buttons, the start buttons, and then you can choose between all these different games like Joust, which is a classic, Robotron, which I love, some of more obscure Williams games like Bubbles, Splat, which is a terrible game, Blaster, which I actually really love, which is the sequel to Robotron 2084, and we even play Sinistar, which is a vertical game, but you can play it horizontally. And then this control panel is not the original control panel, obviously, to accompany the two joysticks and an extra button to play these games. But this is just a real great way to have a lot of diversity in the game as far as Williams goes. Is it all original? No, not really, but it's pretty close proximity. The J-Rock is a very popular addition to most people, and I do still have the original boards and the original power supply for this game. So again, if I wanted to turn it back into a Defender, I could totally do it, and those boards work fine. But this just gives it much more versatility as far as having a game that plays a lot of games. This has got to be the nicest unrestored game I've ever owned in my life. And even though we already have a STARGATE, which will actually play Defender because of the J-Rock board that's installed in the STARGATE, I'm very hesitant to ever get rid of this Defender for a couple reasons. One, it's just so amazing that a game like this has survived so long, unaltered and unmolested. The side art, the cabinet, inside and out, it's just gorgeous. Even the original manual that was in the bottom when we got this game, I don't think it had ever been touched or looked at. The monitor has a brand new tube in it because the original tube just had the worst burn-in you've ever seen. So this game definitely did get played in its lifespan quite a bit. We also replaced the control panel because it had a number of bad cigarette burns. But other than that, it's a perfect version of this classic game. And Williams made a lot of Defenders. They made about 60,000 of these machines. It was by far their best-selling game, neck and neck with the game Joust. But having this kind of thing in here where it's almost like a museum quality piece is really kind of amazing, especially since it is all original and I haven't had to restore it. We just did a lot of heavy cleaning and some technical work on it to make it reliable. In case it's not enough of a space requirement to have these huge arcade games in your house, you're also going to need some sort of space to make a mess, to clean them, for restoration purposes, etc. And we're very fortunate in our house where we have a pretty decent work space in our house, in our basement. And the further along you go with this hobby, you start collecting not only tools and items to fix commonly broken issues, but also a collection of boards and things from other games that you've restored. And again, it's just like any hobby, it just requires more and more space. So we have two games we're restoring right now in the workshop, so let's go take a look at those real quick. This is our 25-inch dedicated Simpsons, made by Konami, came out in 1990. And if you saw one of our previous videos from a while ago, this game is fully working. It's just desperate need of restoration. It has a very cracked front that goes all the way down through the big piece of wood, and the sides to the corners when we moved they were kind of sheared off. It's in pretty dire shape, although complete. So it's now just kind of the Simpsons turn at a full restoration. I'm pretty excited about this one. Eventually we're going to have it play all the classic Konami 4-player games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Bucky O'Hare, all those great games. So this just happens to be the one. It happens to be the Simpsons turn, and this is what we're working on right now. Now this is a really interesting game. This is yet another elevator action, because everyone needs 2 elevator actions, and I know what you're saying if you're an arcade purist. There was no such thing as an elevator action cocktail. But you're actually wrong, because TAITO did make a number of cocktail cabinets. This game started off originally as a jungle hunt cocktail, which is pretty common, and it had this very elaborate kind of swirly-whirly art that unfortunately has been lost through the annals of time by the time I got the game. But there was a kit for elevator action specifically for cocktail conversions of jungle hunt, and this game was indeed factory converted to elevator action. What I've done is we fixed it, rebuilt it, we totally gutted the inside, and it wasn't working when we got it. And the artwork, I actually created this elevator action artwork. This is not the original artwork, and it's not finalized yet. This is just kind of a big sticker underneath here that does not adhere to anything, but it is a new piece of glass. These TAITO cocktails are extremely rare. The only TAITO cocktail you ever really see in great quantities is Space Invaders. Otherwise, they just didn't make very many of them. And this is indeed an elevator action cocktail. My attempt is to make an artwork for the top piece, since I can't reproduce the original kind of swirly artwork that was on there that mimics the upright. What we do from there, I really don't know what I'm going to do with this, because elevator action is a great game. It's one of my favorites, but I really prefer the upright machine to the cocktails. So maybe I'll trade it to another collector or eventually sell this. But it's almost finished, actually. I just need to go through and finalize some of the artwork, get it printed out, and get it done. Inside of these TAITO cocktails, it reminds me a lot of the inside of like a 1970s car hood, because there's just so much space. You could move in here. There's just so much, it's so empty in here. But we replaced the terrible TAITO power supply with a modern switching one and an adapter from arcadeshop.com. And then down here we still have, just like in the full-size elevator action, we have that 5-tier board and the filter harness, which is pretty problematic. And if you ever have one of these TAITO games like elevator action or jungle hunt, your first bet is to kind of resolder all the solder points on these filter boards. That seems to solve a lot of issues. But this should be a good one once it's all finished and complete. It's such a unique game. I'm sure somebody will just love having an elevator cocktail, and I'm going to try to make it look as, well, kind of authentic, a reimagining of what it would be authentically. And they got this little tiny 13-inch color Wells Gardner 4600 monitor in there, which is just dwarfed inside this huge cabinet. I don't know why they could have easily put a 19-inch monitor in there. Oh well. What do I know? So that's our vintage arcade, and thanks for checking out the video. I'm sure I'll have more videos as time goes on, but until then, I'm going to play some Miss Pac-Man, see if I can crack that top 10 in the world record. See you next time. Bye!